I feel like I haven't talked to you guys in a decade. But new year, same me. Are we surprised? I hope not. Hello strangers, welcome back to my channel. I'm so excited to be filming because even though I only took really like a week off, it feels like I haven't been on here in so long. In all seriousness, I feel like I haven't talked to you guys in forever and I missed YouTube, so I'm excited to get back in the saddle today. So I asked you guys on Instagram to send me any questions that you had about vintage. I really want to start focusing on vintage because it's something that I'm super passionate about. As you guys know, you guys love vintage. I love finding it and sharing it with you guys. So we're going to be focusing a lot more on vintage in 2020. And I can't wait. So let's get started into your questions. So I condensed the questions down to the most asked questions because a lot of you guys had the same ones. So the first question is, what are the best vintage brands? Probably the greatest thing about vintage is that brand really doesn't matter. Brand doesn't really start becoming relevant until I would say about the late 80s, maybe even mid 80s, and then to the year 2000. Brands that you see popping up for those decades that are popular would be vintage Calvin Klein, vintage Tommy Hilfiger, even some vintage Guess, Bongo, Ralph Lauren, Wrangler. That's when brands really start to become relevant. Anything earlier than the 80s, brand really doesn't matter unless it's a designer brand. Or something like Gunny Sacks that has a huge following to it. Unless it's a huge brand like that, most people aren't going to know the brand anyways, so it really doesn't matter. One of the most frequent questions was, how do you date home goods? Well, the first thing you do is you ask it out politely. A little vintage humor for you guys, that always gets them. In all seriousness, a lot of you guys asked about how to tell what decade or year an item is from for home goods. That it seems to be harder, and it is a little bit harder. You have to do a little more research. So I am going to be doing a video on Friday all about dating vintage home decor, so keep an eye out for that. But here are just the quick little things that I do when I first go into researching a vintage item. So my first little quick tip is something as simple as just looking for a date. A lot of vintage homemade items will have dates on them. Things like pillows or soft plush toys will have a tag that usually say a date on them. Even some items have those little like foil or paper stickers on the bottom of them, and sometimes that has a date on it. Also, here's a little question for you guys. If somebody knows, when did they start putting those little foil or paper stickers on the bottom of things? I know, if my memory serves me correctly, in Japan it was started in the mid-50s, but I don't know when it was started in America. So if anybody knows, let me know down below because I'm curious to see when that started, because that could help determine something's date as well. Another thing is to look for a maker's mark. There's usually a maker's mark stamp on ceramics and things like that. If it's a painting or a print, look all over in all the corners, look on the back for an artist or some kind of text on there. So that's my first couple little quick tips for determining when a hard good was made. Again, I'm going to be doing a video on it on Friday. I will go more into depth on the home trends of the decades. So that can help you identify items by just knowing the style. So we'll get more into depth with that in that video. Do you think modeling vintage clothing brings more money than photographing on a hanger? In my personal opinion, it may not necessarily bring more money, but in my opinion, it will help the item sell faster. A lot of people are into vintage and they like vintage clothing. They just simply don't know how to wear it in a modern day setting. Also, vintage items, it can kind of be hard to tell what the fit is going to be just by looking at it on a hanger. So I think modeling it either yourself, having a friend model it, or even a mannequin is helpful in selling vintage clothing. Another question I got quite a lot was, what websites do you use to help date items, and also where do you check comps for vintage items? The first part of that, the main website is just good old Google. Typing in an item's description, and again, I will get more into depth with this in Friday's video, but just going into Google and describing your item. Is that a snake in the pond outside? Holy fanoli. That thing just like popped its head up like, hey. No. Anyways, What was I saying? Something as simple as just typing in the description of your item. Describe your item on Google. I mean, the internet is your oyster. That's not even a saying, but you know what I mean. The internet is there at your fingertips. Use it. But one website I did use a lot and still use to this day if I have questions about vintage clothing is vintagefashionguild.org. I think it's org. I could be wrong. Don't hit me if I am. I'll put it on the screen. That website has a huge label resource for you. You can just type in a brand and it will show you the labels of that brand through the decades so that it helps you determine what decade your clothing is from. So that is a great resource. I will leave that link down below, along with some other websites that I've come across just in my journey. So the second part to that question was, where do I check comps for vintage items? If you don't know what comps are, that is where you check to see what items have been selling for, the comparison prices. I typically use eBay. So I'll use eBay, I'll filter by sold and see what the item has sold for because eBay is known for vintage items. I will also go on Etsy. Now, the thing is with Etsy, you can only see what people are selling it for. You can't, to my knowledge, know what it actually sold for. I've never been able to see what an item sold for. I can see the original listing, but it doesn't show the price. If anybody knows that, let me know down below because that is a code I've been trying to crack. And I'm starting to think it's impossible. So if it is, tell me. Crush my dreams. But yeah, I'll go on there and just see how the market's doing, what other sellers are selling an item for. Which leads me to another question that's kind of similar but a little different. And that is, how do you know how to price vintage since it's usually one-of-a-kind pieces? Pricing vintage can sometimes be easy because there's a ton of that specific item. You find it on eBay. You see, that it's selling for about 20 bucks each time it's been sold. And that's easy. But finding pieces that are a little bit more unique can be a little difficult, but just go with your gut. I have started pricing my vintage a little bit differently than a lot of people do, and I'm going to go on a little rant for a second. I think one of the main reasons that people are drawn to fast fashion is because it's simply affordable. It's cheaper, and that's what they can afford. It's out of necessity. And that is another reason why thrifting has become such a huge trend, is because it's cheaper and it's a cheap way to get clothing. Something that deters people from vintage or shopping with vintage shop owners or going into vintage shops or what have you, wherever you go to get your vintage. I think it's a deterrent that the prices are so high. Yes, I agree that some items do hold that value. Designer items, something that has a name attached to it, or some sort of, history attached to it. But there are some items that are they're just simply vintage and they're not worth $55 just because you think it is. It's really, up to you. There's no right or wrong way of pricing vintage, in my opinion. Don't throw stones at me. Obviously, there's collector's items and stuff like that, and that's different. But again, you would find that on a website like eBay. I'll give you a quick example and then I'll shut the hell up. I was listing vintage clothing items yesterday. So I had this plain sweater. It was kind of like an oversized boyfriend sweater, vintage sweater, nice quality, great. I listed it for $19 because it's just a plain sweater. That's what I would expect to pay for a sweater at a store, just a plain sweater. $19 I think is fair. Then I had this two-piece set, which I split up because it was two different sizes, but it's this celestial sun pattern, and it's a button front midi skirt and a button front top. I'll put it on the screen so you guys can see it. It's beautiful. The skirt already sold, actually, and I listed it for $35. I think it sold with an offer to likers for $31, and then the shirt's still there, and I think I listed it for $25. I listed those items a little bit higher, and I'll tell you why. Because they are on trend. They are hot right now. People are looking for celestial patterns that, star pattern and moon and sun and all that celestial stuff, even little cherubs, little baby cherubs. So I knew that those items were hot right now. Sorry, I had to pull up my pants. I know that those items are hot right now, so that's why I listed it a little bit higher, but not anything crazy. I wasn't asking $50 a piece for them. I listed it for $35 and for $25. So that's an example. I hope that helps. I know I went on a tangent and you didn't ask for that and you got it, and I'm sorry, but I'm not sorry. So let's move on. What is your least / most favorite vintage trend? My least favorite, I can tell you right now, is Jinko jeans. Now, before anyone screams at me, those are just excessive. I'm sorry. To me, they're ugly. To someone, they might be beautiful, and that's fine if that floats your boat. But, you know, I'm all for a good wide leg jean, but that's just like, it's too much, you know? It's like a tent. Jinko jeans and Ed Hardy are probably my least favorite vintage trends. My most favorite vintage trend, I have a special spot in my heart for 90s fashion. Not all 90s fashion, but just classy 90s fashion, if that makes sense. Just like classic pieces, mom jeans. I love a good mom jean. Plain and simple 90s fashion. Someone said, can I please just sell vintage and be successful? And I ask myself that every day. Someone said, cleaning. YouTube video on how you clean vintage items. I can definitely do that. I will say that I tend to leave vintage items the way that they are. I don't do a whole lot. If it has a couple stains here and there and I try to get them out and it doesn't come out, it's not a big deal. It's vintage. It's supposed to have wear to it. But I will do a video on how I clean home decor items and do some stain removal on clothing if you guys want to see that. So this was probably the number one question that you guys asked. And it is, what is considered vintage? Also stemming off of that, what is considered antique and what is considered retro. So I'm going to break it down for you guys real quick. Vintage is, by definition, anything 20 years or older. So now, as of today, we are in the year 2020, so that means anything from 2000 and before is vintage. Now, it gets into antique zone when it is 100 years or more. So as of today, anything from the year 1920 to before is antique. There's the definition, plain and simple. Now, retro is a little less straightforward than that. Retro is a word that is used to describe something's appearance, not necessarily its age. Now, certain styles from decades like the 1950s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, some people refer to that style as vintage. Not the decade, but the style of the item. So like kitschy items are considered retro. The main way people use the term retro is to describe something that was recently made to look like something that's older. So for example, this year, Michael's Craft Store did a retro Halloween collection. The items in that collection were made to look like vintage Halloween decor, so those items would be described as retro. So that's it. That's the whole shebang. How hard is it to thrift vintage in larger sizes? That is a great question. And the answer is, it's pretty difficult. I don't come across a lot of plus size vintage pieces, and unfortunately, when I do, they're not great styles. You'll see a lot of skirts in plus size, and you'll see dresses in plus size sometimes, but the dresses will be, they have no shape to them. They'll be like tents, essentially, or just glorified muumuus, sadly. And, you know, that's just how it is. Unfortunately, I have come across a few plus size items, and when I do, I scoop them up because they are hard to come by in a good style. So definitely keep an eye out for them because they can be tricky to find, and just know that, you know, it's going to be a little more difficult. Oh, this is a good question. There's so much good stuff out there. What are your deal breakers when sourcing? I have to have strict deal breakers because I am a vintage hoarder. I will buy everything vintage with the intention of saving it and giving it a new home, and then I will hoard it because it has like not an unfixable flaw, but a flaw that I would have to put in effort to fix. Basically, if something it has a hole in it, or it has just way too many stains, I know in my heart that I am not going to take the time to mend it, and I'm not going to take the time to get the yellowing out around the collar. So if something has yellowing on it, I leave it for somebody else. If it has way too many stains, I'll leave it because I'm not going to take the time to, you know, get those out. Those items, if I buy them, they'll just sit in my house and die. So that's my deal breaker if it requires too much effort, I guess. But I mean, somebody else can find it and they may have no issue getting the yellowing out, and they could, you know, sell that t-shirt for $50. So, you know, it's a win for everybody in my opinion. Somebody asked, determining the different styles through the decades, details to look for. So I actually have a couple videos all about vintage clothing and styles to look out for to help you determine what decade a vintage clothing item is from. So I will leave those 2 videos linked down below if you want to check those out. And then again, stay tuned for Friday. If you haven't already, go ahead and hit that subscribe button and hit the little notification bell so that you're notified when I upload that video. So the last question is, how hard is it to sell vintage clothing? The answer is it's really not that hard to sell vintage clothing, especially now that vintage clothing has become trendy with the rise in thrifting, because a lot of times that's what's available at thrift stores is vintage. So it's become a trendy thing. I think certain styles, especially with clothing, can be a little harder to sell. You know, things like from the 50s or earlier can be a little more difficult to sell. But again, it's all about how you market the item. You can't just pull up a stock photo and swipe the description from the website that it originally came from. You have to put in a little more effort, and you have to come up with your own keywords or do some research on keywords on other people's similar listings. Honestly, vintage is all like, it's just a learning game. It's all just going with your gut and finding your way, and that's it. Vintage is not necessarily harder to sell, it's just different. And it's so fun, so I encourage all of you, if you haven't dipped your toes into the vintage clothing or vintage home decor world, to dip your toes in 2020 and see what awesome things you can find that you may have been skipping over before. It's so fun. Alright, so I hope you guys enjoyed this video. I hope you learned something. Always feel free to leave questions down below. I read every comment and I try to answer as many as I can. So if you have any questions, let me know down below. Also, talk amongst yourselves. Learn from each other. That's what this platform is for. We are a community and we're here to learn together. If you like this video, please be sure and give it a thumbs up on your way out. If you haven't already, hit that subscribe button and join our family. We would love to have you. I put new videos out every Wednesday and Friday, and I will see you guys on Friday. Bye, guys.